I'm not sorry for what I did. He destroyed me. He lied to me.
If I'm given another life, another chance, I'd do it again. I'll do it again in the next
This
life.
court will not validate that thinking. This court will not send the message that love and betrayal justify murder. Bianca, you will not be eligible for parole. You will die in prison for the murder of Stephen Mitchell.
Hello and welcome back to Dark Echoes Crime. I'm your host, and if you've been with us before, you know that we don't just tell you about crime, we explore the human stories beneath it. We examine the moments where love transforms into something darker, where devotion becomes obsession, and where one decision in a single night can destroy everything two people built together over half a decade. Today's story is one of those cases, and I warn you now, by the time we reach the sentencing, you might not know who to believe, who to blame, or whether what happened in that bedroom on a cold November night in North Carolina was premeditated murder or a tragic explosion of a love that had already died. But before we dive in, a quick reminder to like this video and subscribe. Our algorithm rewards engagement, and your support helps us continue bringing you these stories, the ones the mainstream media glosses over, the ones that deserve deeper examination. And our community is built on people like you, people who understand that crime isn't always black and white, that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a knife, but the human heart. After you watch this, I'd love for you to tell me in the comments. Do you think she's a monster, or do you think he destroyed her first? Was this a crime of passion or calculated revenge? This is one of those cases where reasonable people disagree, and I genuinely want to hear where you stand. Now let's begin. The story of Stephen Mitchell and Bianca Torres begins not with violence, but with the kind of love story that seems almost scripted for a romantic movie. It was March 2018 when they met, and both of them were at points in their lives where they thought they knew exactly who they were and what they wanted. Stephen Mitchell was a 34-year-old construction manager based in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was handsome in an understated way, tall, with dark hair that he always kept neatly trimmed, blue eyes that people said were warm and inviting, and a smile that made people feel safe around him. He came from money, not old money, but solid middle-class money. His father had owned a construction company, and Stephen had grown up around blueprints and hard hats. He'd learned the business from the ground up, quite literally working on job sites as a teenager before moving into management. By the time he turned 30, he was making good money, had a nice house in a suburb called Myers Park, and by all accounts, was exactly the kind of man women wanted to date. Bianca Torres was 29 when she met Stephen. She was a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm downtown, intelligent and beautiful in a way that commanded attention when she walked into a room. She had long black hair, dark eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a figure she worked hard to maintain. She came from a working-class background. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a nurse, and she'd put herself through college and law school on her own merit. She was ambitious, driven, and to anyone who knew her, she seemed like she had her entire life perfectly planned out. She wanted to make partner at the firm by 35, wanted to own a house by 32, and she wanted to find a man who understood her drive and ambition rather than feeling threatened by it. They met at a rooftop bar in uptown Charlotte. Stephen's friend David worked at the same law firm as Bianca, and he'd invited Stephen to come out with a group from the office. It was one of those spring evenings where Charlotte is absolutely perfect. Warm but not yet hot, the sky turning pink and orange as the sun set, everyone in that slightly elevated mood that comes when you know summer is coming. Stephen was standing at the bar, waiting for a drink, when Bianca walked up beside him. They started talking about nothing in particular, the crowd, the drinks, whether they'd been to that bar before. Neither of them was trying particularly hard, but there was an ease between them that surprised them both. What started as a casual conversation stretched into the whole evening. They moved to a table with Stephen's friends and Bianca's colleagues, but they kept finding themselves pulled back into conversations with each other, away from the group. By the end of the night, Stephen had gotten Bianca's number, and she'd actually asked for his before he could ask for hers. They both played it cool for exactly 3 days before Stephen texted her. Within a week, they had their first real date, dinner at a trendy Italian restaurant in South End, followed by a walk around Romari Bearden Park where they talked until nearly midnight. By the end of that month, they were dating exclusively. By summer, Stephen had introduced her to his parents. By autumn, she'd moved in with him. And by the time Christmas 2018 rolled around, they were the kind of couple that people pointed to and said, "Those two are going to get married." You can just see it. They had what everyone called the kind of love that lasts. They finished each other's sentences. They made plans together, trips to the beach, renovations to Stephen's house, conversations about maybe getting a dog. Stephen's friends noticed that he seemed happier than they'd ever seen him. Bianca's colleagues at the law firm remarked that she seemed softer somehow, less driven by the ruthless ambition that had previously defined her. She still wanted to make partner, but she no longer seemed willing to sacrifice everything for it. For the first 3 years of their relationship, 2018 through 2021, they were genuinely happy. This isn't something that's contested. Even the prosecution in the case that would eventually unfold agreed that in the early years, these two people loved each other deeply and authentically. They traveled. They renovated Stephen's house together. They adopted a golden retriever named Scout. They talked about getting engaged. Stephen's mother, Claudia Mitchell, would later say in interviews that she'd never seen her son so content. Bianca's father would say that watching his daughter with Stephen made him believe in love again, especially since he'd been widowed for 5 years before they met. But love, as we all know, is not a constant. It's a living thing, and like all living things, it requires maintenance, attention, and sometimes, it simply dies. And this is where the story of Stephen and Bianca begins its slow descent into darkness. The change didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment where Stephen woke up and decided to cheat, just as there was no single moment where Bianca woke up convinced that her partner was betraying her. Instead, it was a series of small erosions, tiny fractures that developed over months and months, each one seemingly insignificant on its own but adding up to something devastating. The first crack came in late 2021, about 3.5 years into their relationship. Stephen's business had been going well, very well actually, and he'd been asked to manage a major commercial development project downtown, a mixed-use building with retail on the ground level and office spaces above. It was the biggest project his company had ever undertaken, and it was a massive career opportunity for him. The problem was that it required all of his attention. The construction business doesn't follow a 9-to-5 schedule, especially when you're managing a major project. Stephen found himself working 12, sometimes 14-hour days. He was on the site in the mornings before the sun came up. He was on conference calls at night after the sun went down. He was working weekends. Bianca tried to be understanding. She really did. But she was also working long hours at her firm. She was on track to make partner, and that meant late nights researching cases, attending networking events, working on pitches for new clients. She'd imagined that once they moved in together, once they committed to each other, they'd at least have evenings and weekends together. Instead, she found herself spending Saturday nights alone, waiting for Stephen to come home from the construction site, exhausted and filthy with dust, talking about structural issues and permit problems while she'd been hoping to go out to dinner or just sit on the couch and watch a movie together. By Christmas 2021, Bianca was noticing something else too. Stephen had started going to the gym more regularly, and not just to the gym they had a membership to together. He joined a fancy CrossFit gym that cost 3 times as much and was across town. He said it was because they had better trainers, better equipment. He'd never been particularly vain before, but now he seemed concerned about his appearance in a way that felt different from before. He'd buy new shirts, new shoes. He'd get his hair cut every 2 weeks instead of every 3. He'd started wearing cologne, something he'd never really done before. Bianca felt the shift, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it meant. When she mentioned it to him, casually, the way you do when you're testing the waters, he got defensive. He said he was just taking better care of himself, that with the stress of the big project, he needed the outlet of working out. He said it was healthy, that she should be glad he was making good choices. And when you said it that way, it made sense. There was nothing inherently wrong with a man wanting to exercise more or care about his appearance. But Bianca had a lawyer's mind, trained to notice patterns and inconsistencies. And when she really thought about it, the pattern had started just after he'd been assigned to the big downtown project. The gym where he trained was only about 10 minutes from the construction site. And sometimes when she'd look at his phone, not snooping but just glancing when he set it down on the counter, she'd notice text notifications from a contact that just said JC. When she asked him who JC was, he said it was a colleague on the project. A project manager named Jonathan Kane. She let it go. She didn't want to be that girlfriend, the jealous one who questioned every text message and every change in routine. She was trying to be secure, to be the kind of partner who trusted her significant other. But something in her gut was telling her that something had shifted. Meanwhile, Stephen was struggling in ways that Bianca didn't fully understand. He was the kind of man who'd always been praised for being capable, for being able to handle anything that came his way. His father had raised him to believe that a man's value was determined by what he could accomplish, how much he could earn, how well he could provide. Stephen had internalized that deeply. He'd built his entire sense of self around being the strong one, the one who had it figured out, the one who could manage the chaos and make everything work. But by late 2021 he was drowning. The downtown project was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. There were permit delays, structural issues that required redesign, conflicts between the various contractors. Stephen was the buffer between all of these competing interests, and he was bearing the weight of it all on his shoulders. He was drinking more than he used to, sometimes a bottle of wine at night, sometimes whiskey. He was sleeping badly. He had developed tension headaches that lasted for days. He felt like he was failing even though objectively the project was still on track. And then there was Jennifer Kane. Jissy. She was the project manager on the downtown development. 31 years old, blonde, energetic, and according to Stephen's later admissions, she seemed to understand the stress he was under in a way that Bianca didn't. Jennifer had worked in construction for almost a decade. She understood the industry, understood the problems they were facing, understood why Stephen had to spend 14 hours a day at the site. More than that, she seemed to admire him. She'd say things like, "I don't know how you manage all of this stress. I'd have given up weeks ago." Or, "The way you handled that vendor dispute was incredible. You're really good at this." These might seem like small compliments, but to Stephen, drowning in stress and doubt, they felt like life rafts. Jennifer represented a world where he was competent, where his problems made sense, where he was appreciated. She also represented something else, a woman who didn't need him to be anything other than what he was in this moment. Bianca, at home, seemed to want him to be the Stephen from the first few years, present, attentive, focused on their relationship. Jennifer asked nothing of him but his time and his attention to the work at hand. What happened between Stephen and Jennifer happened slowly and then all at once, the way these things do. It started with them staying late at the site together, reviewing plans and discussing problems long after the rest of the crew had gone home. Then it was grabbing coffee together in the mornings before the site opened up. Then it was lunch together during the day. There were private text conversations, first about work and then about personal things. Jennifer confided in him about her own struggles, a difficult divorce, an ex-husband who didn't pay child support, the stress of being a single mother working in a male-dominated industry. Stephen found himself wanting to fix her problems, to be the strong one she could lean on. And somewhere in there, the line got crossed. It probably happened in Jennifer's car in the construction site parking lot late one afternoon. Or maybe it was at a hotel during an out-of-state site visit that Stephen told Bianca was just a work trip. The specifics don't matter as much as the fact that it happened, and once it happened, everything changed. Stephen had never been the kind of man who cheated. In his previous relationships, he'd been loyal. He was raised in a traditional household where infidelity was viewed as a profound moral failure. His father had always said that a man's word was his bond, and his word extended to his commitments, including romantic ones. The fact that he was now cheating horrified him, but also, somewhere deep inside, the attention and validation from Jennifer made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in months. He felt like less of a failure around her. He felt seen and understood. And so, like most people who cheat, he compartmentalized. He had his real life, his life with Bianca, the house, the dog, the committed relationship. And he had this other thing with Jennifer, which he told himself was temporary, just a release valve for the stress he was under. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He told himself he was going to end it, that he just needed a little more time. Bianca began to sense something was genuinely wrong in January 2022. She didn't have proof. There were no graphic text messages, no hotel receipts in his wallet, nothing she could point to and say, "Ah, I knew it." Instead, she had the collection of small signs. The way he'd become distant when they were in bed together. The way he seemed distracted when she talked about her day. The fact that his phone seemed to be going off constantly, and he always made sure to check it immediately, always taking it with him when he got up to go to the bathroom or make a phone call. The way he sometimes smelled like a cologne he hadn't worn in their house, like he'd showered and changed before coming home. The way he'd tell her he was working late on a Saturday night, and she'd drive to the construction site out of genuine concern. Maybe he'd gotten hurt, maybe there was an emergency, and he wouldn't be there. One night in February 2022, Bianca made a decision. She didn't particularly feel good about the decision, but she made it anyway. She called him at the construction site, said she wasn't feeling well and was going to head to bed early. Then, instead of going to bed, she got in her car and drove to the downtown construction site. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. The site was closed for the day, but there were security lights on, and she could see inside through the temporary fencing. Stephen's truck was parked around back, in the area designated for management vehicles. As she watched, she saw him emerge from the construction office, a temporary trailer where the project managers worked. He wasn't alone. He was with a blonde woman, Jennifer, and she had her hand on his arm in a way that was absolutely not professional. Bianca sat in her car for maybe 5 minutes, not moving, barely breathing, just watching as Stephen and Jennifer talked, their heads close together, laughing about something. And then she saw something that made her stomach drop. Stephen reached over and tucked a strand of Jennifer's hair behind her ear. It was such a tender gesture, such an intimate gesture. It was a gesture he hadn't made toward Bianca in months. She didn't wait to see anything more. She drove away, pulled over about 2 miles away, and cried in her car for an hour. Not the kind of crying where you get it out and feel better. The kind of crying that comes from your soul breaking. She kept thinking about all the conversations they'd had, all the ways he'd told her he was working late and he'd been lying. All the promises they'd made to each other. All the future they'd talked about. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of her life. When Stephen came home at around midnight, Bianca was waiting for him. She was sitting on the couch in the dark, the television off, just sitting in the silence. When he turned on the lights and saw her, his face went white. On some level he knew. He'd probably known for weeks that the lie couldn't hold forever. Bianca had a lawyer's mind and she would figure it out eventually. He'd just been buying time. "I drove to the site tonight," Bianca said quietly. "I saw you with someone." Stephen didn't try to deny it. That might have been better in some ways. A good lie, well told, might have given him a chance to maintain plausible deniability. But Stephen, in that moment, was too shocked to lie effectively. "Bianca, Is that where you've been going?" she interrupted him. "To the gym and to the site to see her?" "It's not what you think," he said, and the moment those words came out of his mouth, he knew how stupid they sounded. Because actually, it was probably exactly what she thought. "What is it then? Explain it to me. Because I would genuinely love to hear an explanation for why you've been lying to me every single day for months." Stephen sat down on the arm of the couch, suddenly looking exhausted. "It just happened," he said, which was technically true and completely inadequate at the same time. "I never planned it. She was just there and I was stressed and you wanted her more than you wanted me," Bianca finished for him. "That's what 'it just happened' means? That you made a choice." "I don't want her more than I want you," Stephen said, and he actually believed this. He was in love with Bianca. He wanted to be with Bianca. But he was also attracted to Jennifer, and more importantly, Jennifer made him feel like a competent version of himself when he felt like he was falling apart. "I was confused. I am confused. But I don't want to lose you." "That's not really up to you," Bianca said. She was very calm now, in that way that sometimes happens after you've received a shock. There's a period of almost clinical clarity, before the real pain sets in. "You already lost me. You lost me on the day you decided lying to me was better than telling me you were unhappy. And every day after that, you lost me a little bit more." Over the next few weeks, they had the kind of conversations that couples have after infidelity is discovered. There were tears. There was anger. There were attempts at reconciliation and then withdrawal from those attempts. Stephen said he'd end things with Jennifer immediately. He said he'd go to couples therapy with Bianca. He said he'd do anything to fix this. And Bianca wanted to believe him. She really did. They'd built 5 years together. They'd made plans. She didn't want to throw all of that away. But here's the thing about trust that people don't always understand. Once it's broken, it doesn't just snap back together. It might feel repaired on the surface, but underneath, the fracture is still there. And every little thing that happens after that point, every late night, every text message, every moment he seems distant, gets funneled into that crack in the foundation. For the next 6 months, from February 2022 to August 2022, Bianca and Stephen tried to repair their relationship. They went to couples therapy. Stephen's therapist said he had abandonment issues stemming from his childhood. His father, while present, had been emotionally distant, and Stephen had internalized the belief that love was something you had to earn through success and achievement. Jennifer had offered him admiration without condition, and that had been intoxicating to someone who usually had to perform for love. Stephen's therapist said he needed to work on his self-worth and his understanding of what a healthy partnership looked like. Bianca's individual therapist said she needed to process the betrayal and figure out whether she could actually move past it or whether she was holding on to resentment that would eventually poison the relationship regardless. They both wanted it to work. They both tried. But the truth is, sometimes trying isn't enough. The thing that finally tipped the scales came in August 2022, about 6 months after Bianca had discovered the affair. Stephen had told Bianca that he had ended things with Jennifer. He said he'd been clear that they could only have a professional relationship moving forward. For a while, Bianca believed him. But then she started noticing the signs again. His phone going off. Him taking it into the bathroom. Him telling her he had to go back to the site for something he'd forgotten, disappearing for hours. By this point, Bianca's suspicion had metastasized into something darker: obsession. She began checking his phone bill online, looking at his cell records. She set up a location tracker on his phone without his knowledge, something her lawyer's knowledge of technology made easy. She drove by the construction site at odd hours. She wasn't being rational anymore. She was operating on pure hurt and betrayal and the desperate need to know the truth. And then came the day she saw Jennifer's Instagram post. It was a selfie of Jennifer and Steven at a restaurant, a fancy restaurant in downtown Charlotte, somewhere they'd gone on a date before. The caption was vague: "Great dinner with an amazing colleague," but the photo was unmistakable. They were sitting close together, and Steven was smiling in a way that Bianca hadn't seen in months. The way he used to smile at her. She called him from her car, her hands shaking. "You're at dinner with her right now?" There was a long pause. "Bianca, it's not what you think. It's a work thing. There were others there." But the timestamp on Jennifer's post said the photo was taken 20 minutes ago, and there was nobody else visible in the photo. And Bianca was a lawyer, which meant she understood how evidence worked, and this was evidence of a lie, plain and simple. "I'm done," she said quietly. "I'm going to give you a week to move out. I want you to call your landlord or find somewhere else because I'm done with this." "You're not giving me a chance to explain," Steven said, and his voice was pleading now. "Bianca, please. You had your chance. You had months of chances. You lied to me again. That's it. We're done." But here's where the story takes another turn, because Bianca had a crisis of conscience over the following week. She loved Steven. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, despite knowing that he'd been with another woman, she loved him. And being alone in that house with Scout, sleeping in the bed they'd shared, she realized that she didn't want him to leave. She wanted him to stay. She wanted him to choose her, to really choose her, to prove that she mattered more than whatever this thing with Jennifer was. So when Steven came to her, devastated and terrified of losing her, and asked if they could try again, really try this time, Bianca said yes. She said yes because she loved him. She said yes because she wanted to believe in second chances. She said yes because the alternative was admitting that 5 years had been wasted, and she wasn't ready to do that. But this time, something was fundamentally different. This time, Bianca's hurt had solidified into something harder than sadness. It had turned into resentment, and resentment is a poison that seeps into everything. Over the next year and a half, from August 2022 until the events that would lead to Steven's death in November 2023, Bianca and Steven lived in what could only be described as a state of cold warfare. They stayed together. They still shared a bedroom, still went to dinners with friends, still maintained the appearance of a couple. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Bianca couldn't let go of what he'd done. She couldn't forgive it. Her lawyer's mind meant that she cataloged every moment that might indicate he was lying again, might indicate that he was seeing Jennifer again. When he said he was working late, she didn't believe him. When he went to the gym, she wondered if that's really where he was going. She checked his phone when he was in the shower. She monitored his location. She knew the passwords to his email accounts and his social media. Steven, for his part, tried to be better. He quit the downtown project, the one that had consumed him and led to the affair, and moved to a different position within his company that was less demanding. He spent more time at home. He gave up his expensive gym membership and started exercising at the gym they shared. He handed over his passwords without objection when Bianca asked for them. He was trying to rebuild the trust, trying to prove that he'd learned his lesson. But Bianca couldn't receive it. She'd been broken by his betrayal, and she couldn't quite find her way back to trusting him, or maybe more importantly, to trusting herself. How had she not seen it? How had she been so foolish as to believe his lies for months? These were the questions that circled in her mind, and they made her hypervigilant, suspicious, angry in ways she couldn't quite control. Their arguments became more frequent and more vicious. They fought about things that should have been small but had become freighted with the weight of his infidelity. He was late coming home from work. That was about the affair. He was texting on his phone. That was about Jennifer. He wanted to go out for drinks with his friends. That was obviously so he could meet up with someone else. Every single thing he did got filtered through the lens of his betrayal. And Steven, after months of trying, began to get tired. He loved Bianca, he really did, but he was also being treated like he was guilty of a crime that he was trying to atone for. He couldn't seem to do anything right. He was trying to be better, trying to be the man she wanted him to be, but it wasn't working. He was exhausted, and he was starting to resent her for her resentment. By the middle of 2023, about a year after they'd recommitted to their relationship, they were in a vicious cycle of fight, reconciliation, resentment, and repeat. It was during this time that Bianca made another decision. She decided that if Stephen wouldn't be loyal to her, she would make sure that he couldn't be with anyone else. If she couldn't have him, then in her mind, nobody would. This wasn't something she articulated out loud, but it was present in everything she did. She began to isolate him. She didn't like his friends anymore, said they were a bad influence. She got mad when he wanted to spend time with his family. She created scenes at dinners with his colleagues that made him not want to bring her around. She was systematically cutting him off from every relationship in his life except her. And on some level, Stephen was allowing this to happen. Why? Because he felt guilty. He felt like he deserved to be punished for what he'd done. He felt like if he just accepted her control, just accepted her anger and her suspicion, then maybe eventually he could make it up to her. Maybe eventually she'd forgive him and they could go back to the way they were. But you can't go back. Time moves in only one direction. The people you were before don't exist anymore. The trust that was broken can't be made whole. And love, when it's been deeply betrayed, sometimes curdles into something else entirely. By October 2023, Stephen was miserable. He'd quit the gym entirely because Bianca was convinced he was using it as a cover to see Jennifer. He wasn't seeing his friends because every time he mentioned it, Bianca would get angry and pick a fight about it. His relationship with his family had become strained because he kept canceling family events to avoid upsetting Bianca. He was being monitored and controlled and suspected of infidelity every single day, and even though he had learned from his mistake and hadn't cheated again, he was being treated like a criminal anyway. And so, in October 2023, Stephen did something that many men in his position do. He stopped trying. He stopped fighting for the relationship. He stopped attempting to prove his fidelity and his devotion. He became emotionally withdrawn. He started spending more time alone, more time at work, less time engaging with Bianca. And when Bianca asked him what was wrong, he said nothing. When she asked if he still loved her, he gave non-committal answers. When she asked if he was thinking about leaving her, he didn't deny it. What Stephen was really experiencing was something very human and very understandable. He was grieving the relationship while still being in it. He was mourning the woman Bianca had been before he'd betrayed her trust, the relationship they'd had before he'd cheated, the future they'd planned before his lies had blown everything apart. He was sad and he was tired and he was trying to figure out how he could possibly move forward from this. But Bianca, observing his withdrawal, interpreted it not as grief but as rejection. He was pulling away from her because he didn't love her anymore. He was pulling away because he wanted to be with someone else. He was pulling away because she wasn't enough for him. And as the weeks went on, as Stephen's distance grew, Bianca's hurt deepened. Here's what's important to understand about Bianca at this point in the story. She was not a woman planning a murder. She was a woman who was drowning in pain and couldn't figure out how to swim. She was a woman who had given everything to a relationship, and in her mind, that relationship was being stolen from her by the man she'd shared it with. She was a woman who was so hurt that she couldn't think clearly anymore. The rational, brilliant lawyer who'd built a successful career was being overwhelmed by a heart that felt betrayed beyond repair. Throughout October and November 2023, Bianca's mental state deteriorated. She began drinking more. She stopped sleeping well. She became obsessed with the idea that Stephen was cheating on her again, that he was preparing to leave her for someone else. She'd go through his phone so frequently that Stephen stopped bothering to hide anything. She'd take screenshots of his text conversations, innocuous texts about work projects or plans to meet friends, and craft elaborate narratives about what he was really doing. She started seeing a therapist during this time, and she told her therapist that she felt like she was losing her mind, that she couldn't stop thinking about Stephen's infidelity, that every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of him with Jennifer. The therapist recommended that she consider whether the relationship was serving her, whether staying in a situation where she was constantly triggered by betrayal was healthy for her mental health. The therapist suggested that maybe it was time to consider ending the relationship for her own well-being. But Bianca couldn't end it. Ending the relationship meant acknowledging that 5 years had been wasted on someone who didn't deserve her. Ending the relationship meant she'd failed at something she'd committed to. Ending the relationship meant that she'd have to start over, and at 34 years old, she was terrified of being alone. So instead of ending it, she did something else. She started talking about what she would do if Stephen ever cheated on her again or if she found out he was still seeing Jennifer. She was with some friends for dinner in mid-November, about 3 weeks before his death, and she said something that one of those friends would later testify about in court. She said, "If I ever found out he was with someone else, I don't know what I'd do. I might seriously hurt him. I don't think I could control myself." This comment should have alarmed her friends, and to some degree it did. But they also understood it in the context of what Bianca had been going through. They thought she meant it as hyperbole, as the kind of thing people say when they're angry and hurt. They didn't think she meant it literally. They didn't imagine that she was serious. But Bianca was becoming more serious, more obsessed, more unmoored from reality. By the end of October, she was convinced that Stephen was actively cheating on her with Jennifer. She had no real evidence. They'd broken up years ago, and as far as anyone knew, Stephen had actually been faithful since August 2022. But Bianca's paranoia and hurt had constructed an alternative reality where Stephen was betraying her constantly. She called Jennifer multiple times, confronting her, telling her to stay away from Stephen. Jennifer, who'd moved on with her life, didn't understand what Bianca was talking about. They weren't together anymore. She hadn't spoken to Stephen in months. But Bianca didn't believe her. Bianca was convinced that Jennifer was lying, that they were having secret meetings, that they were still together despite all appearances to the contrary. By early November, Bianca was spiraling. She had stopped going to work, telling her law firm that she was taking a medical leave for mental health reasons. She was home every day monitoring Stephen's phone, following him if he left the house, confronting him about where he'd been and who he'd been with. Stephen, faced with this level of obsession, was contemplating leaving. He didn't know how to help Bianca, and he was starting to feel suffocated by her obsession. What happened on November 15, 2023 has been the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. Was it a planned murder? Was it a crime of passion? Was it an accident that escalated? Let me take you through the events of that night as they unfolded, and let me tell you about the evidence that was presented in court, so you can make your own judgment about what really happened. November 15, 2023 was a Wednesday. Stephen had come home around 6 o'clock in the evening from work. He'd had a normal day at the office, nothing unusual. He brought takeout home, Thai food from their favorite restaurant on South Tryon Street. Bianca was home when he arrived. They ate dinner together somewhat quietly. According to the neighbor's testimony later, there were no sounds of unusual argument coming from the house. They seemed relatively calm. After dinner, Stephen took a shower and got into bed around 9 o'clock. He said he was tired and wanted to get some sleep. Bianca said she was going to stay up and read for a while. She said she'd join him later. What actually happened over the next few hours depends largely on whose account you believe. There was no surveillance camera in the bedroom. There were no witnesses. The only two people who were in that room were Stephen and Bianca, and only one of them would survive the night to tell what happened. According to Bianca's account, which she gave to the police when they arrived, and which she maintained throughout the trial, here's what happened. She went to bed around midnight. She got into bed next to Stephen, and he woke up slightly but didn't fully wake. She lay there for about 30 minutes, unable to sleep, her mind racing. At around 12:30 a.m., she decided to check his phone. This had become a nightly ritual for her at this point. She picked up his phone from the nightstand, being careful not to wake him. She opened his phone, she knew the passcode, and began scrolling through his text messages. And that's when she saw something that, in her mind, confirmed everything she'd been suspecting. There was a message from a contact labeled J. Kane. The message was from earlier that day, around 3 p.m., and it said, "Hey, wanted to catch up. Are you free to talk?" Now here's the thing about this message, it was innocuous. It was the kind of message a colleague or former colleague might send. But Bianca had constructed an entire narrative in her mind where this message was evidence of an ongoing affair. She became convinced that Stephen and Jennifer had been together that day, or that he was planning to meet her, or that their affair had never actually ended. She woke Stephen up, forcefully according to her own account, and demanded to know who he was texting with. Stephen, groggy and confused, asked her what she was talking about. She showed him the message. And he did something that, in that moment, seemed like the worst possible thing he could do. He lied. He said he didn't know who it was, that it was probably spam, that she was overreacting. This, according to Bianca, was the moment everything changed. The lie was the last straw. She felt it as a fundamental rejection, as proof that he didn't respect her enough to tell her the truth, as evidence that he was still actively betraying her. What happened next is where accounts diverge wildly. According to Bianca, she was so upset by the lie that she got out of bed. She was crying, hyperventilating, in a state of acute panic and anguish. She said she went to the kitchen to get some water to try to calm herself down. While she was in the kitchen, she said she found a knife, a large kitchen knife that was part of their knife block. She said she stood there in the kitchen holding the knife, thinking about everything that had happened, everything Stephen had done, and she said that she felt something break inside her. The pain was so great, she said, that she felt like she couldn't bear it anymore. She said she went back to the bedroom and she woke Stephen up again. She said she was holding the knife, but she said she didn't know why, that she wasn't thinking clearly. She said Steven saw the knife and he got out of bed. She said he came toward her, and she said it was in the struggle that the knife ended up inside him. She said she didn't intentionally stab him, that it happened in confusion and fear and pain. But here's where the prosecution's case came in, because the prosecution did not believe Bianca's account. The prosecution's forensic evidence suggested that there were multiple stab wounds, 7 in total, and that the wound pattern suggested deliberation and force. They didn't believe that this was an accidental stabbing in the course of a struggle. They believed that Bianca, in a fit of rage, stabbed Steven repeatedly and intentionally. The medical evidence showed that Steven had been stabbed 7 times. The deepest wound went through his heart. He died relatively quickly, within minutes. Most of the wounds were on his chest and torso, but one was on his right arm, a defensive wound, according to the prosecution, suggesting he tried to protect himself as she came at him with the knife. But Bianca's defense attorney argued something different. Her attorney argued that the forensic evidence was actually ambiguous. Multiple stab wounds didn't necessarily mean premeditation or intent to kill. A person in a heightened emotional state, stabbed in a panic, could cause multiple wounds without clear intent. The wound on his arm could have come from the struggle. And even if Bianca had stabbed Steven, even if that was clear, the question of her mental state at the time mattered. She'd been experiencing a mental health crisis for weeks. She wasn't thinking rationally. The killing, according to her defense, could be manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. But there were other pieces of evidence that complicated Bianca's account. First, there was the knife itself. Bianca claimed she just picked it up from the knife block in the kitchen. But forensic analysis of the knife block showed that the knife had a very particular place. One slot in the block was notably empty, and it was the one where a large chef's knife should go. The knife that was used to kill Steven was not that knife. Instead, it was a different knife, one that Bianca rarely used. It was a knife that typically sat in a drawer, not in the block. This suggested that she'd gone to the drawer specifically to get this particular knife, rather than just grabbing whatever was convenient. Second, there was a timeline issue. According to the police investigation, Steven had been dead for approximately 2 to 3 hours when the police found him. Bianca called 911 at 2:47 a.m. But that meant that the killing would have happened around midnight to 12:30 a.m., the time when she said she checked his phone and found the message from Jennifer. During those 2 to 3 hours before she called 911, what was Bianca doing? This is where the prosecution's case became more compelling. According to the forensics, Bianca had cleaned herself up after the killing. There was no blood on her clothing. She must have changed clothes or removed the one she was wearing. There were no signs of Steven's blood on her hands or face or body except in a few places that could be explained by her calling 911 and touching him in attempt to help. She also had time to construct a narrative. When the police arrived and found Steven's body in the bed, Bianca was remarkably composed, according to the officers who arrived at the scene. She was not hysterical. She was not in shock. She was sitting on the couch and she calmly explained that they'd had a fight, that Steven had been abusive, that he'd lunged at her, that in the struggle the knife had ended up in his chest. But the police also found something else, Bianca's phone records. Over the 2 to 3 hours between when Steven died and when she called 911, she had texted several people. She texted her best friend saying, "I think I did something terrible, but I'm not sure what." She texted her mother saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." These messages, the prosecution argued, suggested that she knew exactly what had happened and was constructing a narrative to minimize her culpability. Most damning of all, the police found her browser history. In the 2 hours after Steven died and before she called 911, Bianca had searched the internet for several things. How long does it take to die from stab wounds? Can you be convicted of murder if you claim self-defense? North Carolina self-defense laws, and how to talk to police after a crime. These searches suggested that she knew exactly what had happened, that she was trying to figure out what she was looking at, and that she was trying to prepare her defense before she even called the police. This was not the behavior of someone who was acting in the heat of passion, who was confused about what had happened, who wasn't thinking clearly. This was the behavior of someone who was covering her tracks. So when the case went to trial in the spring of 2024, the prosecution laid out this narrative. Bianca Torres had become obsessed with the idea that her boyfriend was cheating on her. Over weeks and months, this obsession had grown, fed by her own paranoia and her mental state. When she saw the message from Jennifer Kane, a message that was completely innocent in context but which Bianca had interpreted as proof of an ongoing affair, something in her snapped. She was going to punish Steven for his betrayal. She was going to make sure he could never be with anyone else. She deliberately went to the kitchen, deliberately selected a specific knife, and deliberately stabbed her boyfriend 7 times, killing him. That was the prosecution's case, premeditated first-degree murder. But Bianca's defense attorney presented a different case. He argued that Bianca was a woman experiencing a genuine mental health crisis. She'd been traumatized by Steven's infidelity months earlier. She'd been unable to move past it or properly process it. She'd spiraled into obsession and paranoia, to the point where she was no longer thinking clearly or rationally. When she saw the message from Jennifer in her compromised mental state, she interpreted it as the final betrayal, the ultimate proof that Steven didn't respect her or value the relationship. What happened next, according to the defense, was not planned murder. It was a woman in psychological crisis having what could only be described as a mental breakdown. She wasn't thinking about consequences. She wasn't constructing a premeditated plan. She was operating on pure emotional devastation and pain. The multiple stab wounds weren't evidence of calculated murder. They were evidence of a person in psychological distress lashing out in a moment of extreme emotional upheaval. As for the searches she'd done after the killing, the defense argued that Bianca, in the aftermath of what she'd done, began to panic and tried to figure out what was happening. The searches were evidence of her confusion and fear, not evidence of premeditation. And as for changing her clothes and cleaning up, the defense argued that these actions could be explained by shock and survival instinct, not by a murderer covering her tracks. People do strange things when they're in shock. They clean things. They try to make sense of what's happening. These actions didn't necessarily indicate guilt so much as confusion. The trial lasted 3 weeks. There were expert witnesses. A psychiatrist testified for the defense that Bianca was suffering from a serious mental health crisis at the time of the killing, that she was experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder related to Steven's infidelity, and that her judgment was severely compromised. A prosecution psychiatrist testified that while Bianca may have had mental health issues, they didn't explain away the calculated nature of the killing, the selection of a specific knife, the 7 stab wounds, the cleanup afterward. There was testimony from friends and family members. Steven's mother, Claudia Mitchell, testified about how much she loved both Steven and Bianca, about how happy they'd been together, and about how heartbroken she was by what had happened. Bianca's father testified about his daughter's mental state over the past year, about how he'd watched her deteriorate, about how worried he'd been about her. He testified that his daughter was not a murderer, that she was a woman who'd been broken by betrayal and couldn't put herself back together. There was testimony about the night itself. The police officers who arrived at the scene testified about what they found. The medical examiner testified about the nature of Steven's injuries. Jennifer Kane testified that she hadn't been in contact with Steven in years, that she was shocked to learn that her innocent message had apparently triggered whatever happened that night. By the end of the trial, the jury was faced with a fundamental question. Was this premeditated murder, or was this a tragedy born out of psychological distress and emotional crisis? Was Bianca Torres a woman who coldly and calculatedly murdered her boyfriend? Or was she a woman who was so damaged by betrayal that she couldn't function anymore and snapped in a moment of ultimate pain? The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 3rd day they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Bianca received the verdict with no visible reaction. She stood at the defense table, her hands folded in front of her, and she said nothing. But something in her face had changed. Something had shifted. Later that day, her attorney would report that Bianca seemed almost relieved that the verdict had come in, that the waiting was over. And then came the sentencing phase. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray afternoon in May 2024. Judge David Holloway, a 58-year-old jurist who'd been on the bench for 22 years, presided. Judge Holloway was exactly the kind of judge that Bianca's attorney had hoped they wouldn't get. He was conservative, traditional, and not particularly sympathetic to claims of mental health issues as explanations for violent crime. He believed in personal responsibility and in proportionate punishment. Before sentencing, there were victim impact statements. Claudia Mitchell, Steven's mother, spoke about her son. She talked about the little boy he'd been, full of curiosity and kindness. She talked about watching him grow into a man and become a successful businessman. She talked about how much he'd loved Bianca, how hard he'd tried to fix their relationship after his infidelity, how he'd done everything he could to earn back her trust. And she talked about how he'd been murdered by the woman he loved, stabbed to death in his own bed, and how that knowledge would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I know that Bianca was hurt," Claudia said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "I know that Steven broke her trust and that was a terrible thing. But hurting people isn't an excuse for killing them. Betrayal doesn't justify murder. And my son didn't deserve to die like that. He didn't deserve to be stabbed 7 times by the woman he loved in his own home, where he should have been safe. Bianca's father also spoke. He spoke about his daughter, about how proud he'd been of her accomplishments, about how much he'd watched her suffer over the past year. My daughter is not a murderer, he said, his voice breaking. She's a woman who loved a man who was betrayed by him, who couldn't process that betrayal. She needed help. She needed mental health treatment. Instead, the system failed her, and now she's going to prison for the rest of her life for one moment in time when she wasn't thinking clearly. Then it was Bianca's turn to address the court. She had the right to make a statement before sentencing. Her attorney had advised her to express remorse, to show contrition, to give the judge some reason to show her mercy. He told her that judges were more likely to show leniency if the defendant expressed genuine regret. But Bianca didn't express regret. Instead, she stood up and she looked directly at Judge Holloway, and she said something that would reverberate through the courtroom and through news coverage of the trial for weeks afterward. "I'm not sorry," she said, her voice completely calm. "I'm not sorry for what I did. He destroyed me. He lied to me. He betrayed my trust. He didn't just cheat on me once, he lied to me about it for months. And even after I found out, even after we tried to work through it, he kept lying. He kept disrespecting me. He kept making me feel like I wasn't enough for him. So I'm not sorry. If I'm given another life, another chance, I'd do it again. I'll do it again in the next life." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge seemed stunned for a moment. Bianca's attorney put his head in his hands. The prosecutor sat back in his chair with an expression of vindication. Judge Holloway took a moment to compose himself. And then he began to speak. "Miss Torres," he said, his voice measured and heavy with authority, "in my 22 years on this bench, I have seen a great many things. I have seen people who have committed terrible acts express genuine remorse, and I have shown them mercy because they understood the gravity of what they'd done. I have seen people express sorrow for their victims and for their victims' families, and I have taken that into account in sentencing. But I have also seen people, not often but occasionally, who seem to believe that their pain justifies the pain they inflict on others. I have seen people who have convinced themselves that they are the victim in a situation where they have taken another person's life. You are expressing that kind of thinking right now. Let me be very clear about something. Stephen Mitchell was not perfect. He cheated on you. He lied to you. He betrayed your trust. Those are facts and they are not being disputed. He hurt you. That is also a fact. And I understand that betrayal is painful. I understand that infidelity can shake the foundations of a person's sense of self-worth and safety in a relationship. But here is what I also understand. Hurt does not give us the right to kill. Betrayal does not justify murder. Pain does not excuse violence. If it did, if we allowed people to kill others based on the depth of their emotional suffering, then society would collapse into chaos. We would have no law, no order, no safety for anyone. You had options. You could have ended your relationship. You could have demanded that Stephen move out and then separated from him. You could have worked through your trauma in therapy. You could have chosen to forgive him or chosen to move on. Instead, you chose to kill him. And then, worst of all, you seem to believe that you were justified in doing so. This court will not validate that thinking. This court will not send the message that love and betrayal justify murder. And I'm going to impose a sentence that reflects the seriousness of what you have done. Bianca Torres, I am sentencing you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life in the North Carolina Department of Corrections. You will not be eligible for release. You will not be eligible for parole consideration. You will die in prison for the murder of Stephen Mitchell. And maybe, over the course of your incarceration, you will come to understand the gravity of what you've done. Maybe you will come to understand that love does not justify killing, that pain does not justify violence, that betrayal does not give us the right to take another person's life. If you can reach that understanding, perhaps there can be some redemption for you. But I will not sentence you based on the hope that you might eventually understand. I will sentence you based on what you have done and what you have said today in this courtroom. This sentence is imposed with the understanding that Stephen Mitchell will never graduate to a career milestone. Stephen Mitchell will never marry someone who can truly love him without the taint of his past mistakes. Stephen Mitchell will never have children. Stephen Mitchell will never grow old. All of that was stolen from him by the woman he loved, in a moment of rage and violence that can never be undone. Life without parole. Court is adjourned. And with that, Bianca Torres was led out of the courtroom by guards. She did not cry. She did not show emotion. She looked almost serene, as if, now that the legal process was over, she could finally rest. That, in its essential form, is the story of Stephen Mitchell and Bianca Torres. But I want to spend some time now talking about what this case means, what it tells us, and why it has generated the kind of passionate debate that we see in cases like this. Because here's the thing. If you ask people about this case, you'll get wildly different reactions. Some people will tell you that Bianca is a monster, that she murdered her boyfriend in cold blood and then had the audacity to express no remorse for it. These people point to the evidence, the deliberate selection of the knife, the 7 stab wounds, the cleanup afterward, the internet searches about murder and self-defense. They point to the fact that she lied to the police, that she initially claimed it was self-defense even though there was no evidence that Stephen had ever been violent toward her. They point to her unrepentant statement in court as proof that she's a dangerous, sociopathic person who should never be allowed back into society. But other people will tell you that this case is a tragedy, that both Stephen and Bianca are victims in a way. These people point to the trauma that Bianca experienced when her partner of 5 years betrayed her. They point to the fact that she was suffering from mental health issues, that she was paranoid and obsessed and not thinking clearly. They point to the reality that Stephen did hurt her, that he did lie to her, that he did betray her trust repeatedly. And they say that while what Bianca did was wrong, it wasn't the act of a cold-blooded murderer but rather the act of a broken person who had reached her breaking point. And most people, I think, fall somewhere in between these two positions. Most people can acknowledge that what Bianca did was wrong, that murder was not justified, that she deserves to be held accountable for taking another person's life. But most people can also understand that this wasn't a simple case of evil versus good, monster versus victim. Most people can see how two people who loved each other could spiral into a situation where tragedy became inevitable. So what do I think? Well, I'll tell you what the evidence suggests to me. The evidence suggests that Stephen Mitchell was a good man who made a terrible mistake. He cheated on his girlfriend. He betrayed her trust. He lied about it repeatedly. He hurt her deeply. And then, even after he'd been caught, even after he'd said he would change, he couldn't seem to commit to really earning back her trust. He became resentful of her monitoring and her suspicion, even though those things were direct consequences of his own actions. That doesn't make him a villain, but it does suggest that he bore some responsibility for the deterioration of the relationship. The evidence also suggests that Bianca Torres is not a cold-blooded murderer in the traditional sense. A cold-blooded murderer doesn't spiral into obsession and paranoia. A cold-blooded murderer doesn't suffer a mental health crisis. A cold-blooded murderer doesn't search the internet frantically after the crime trying to figure out what they've done. Cold-blooded murder requires a kind of detachment and clarity of purpose that Bianca clearly did not possess. She was not a murderer before she killed Stephen. She was a woman in psychological distress. But, and this is crucial, understanding that does not excuse what she did. Even if Bianca was suffering from a mental health crisis, even if she was traumatized and paranoid and not thinking clearly, she still took a knife and she still stabbed Stephen 7 times. She still took his life. She still destroyed his future. And she still seemed, at the moment of sentencing, to believe that she was justified in doing so. This is what makes the case so tragic and so important. Because it suggests something about human nature that we often don't want to acknowledge. That good people can do terrible things. That people who love each other can hurt each other so deeply that the relationship becomes poison beyond repair. That trauma can warp our thinking so profoundly that we can come to believe that killing someone is justified. And that once we cross that line, once we take another person's life, there's no going back. There's no undo button. There's just the rest of our lives to live with what we've done. What I want to say to you, the viewer, is this: if you are in a relationship where you've been betrayed, where you've been hurt deeply, where you feel like you're losing your mind trying to process the betrayal, please reach out for help. Talk to a therapist. Talk to a trusted friend or family member. Consider whether the relationship is serving your mental health or destroying it. And consider whether staying is worth the cost to your own well-being. And if you are in a relationship where you've been the one to cause hurt through infidelity or betrayal, please understand that your partner's pain is real and legitimate, even if it doesn't justify their actions. Understand that betrayal has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate aftermath. Understand that if you've broken your partner's trust, you have to be willing to genuinely work to rebuild it, not just go through the motions. And understand that if you can't do that, the kindest thing might be to let the relationship go. Because Stephen and Bianca's story didn't have to end the way it did. If Stephen had been more honest about his needs and his struggles in the relationship, maybe he wouldn't have sought validation elsewhere. If Bianca had been willing to truly process her trauma and consider leaving the relationship, maybe she wouldn't have spiraled into the obsession that consumed her. If both of them had understood that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes the healthiest thing is to let go, maybe Stephen would still be alive today. Bianca Torres is now serving her sentence at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh. According to reports from people who have visited her, she remains largely unrepentant. She's written letters from prison, some of which have been published in various media outlets, in which she continues to express her belief that Stephen's infidelity justified what she did. She's become something of a cause célèbre among a certain segment of people who believe that she was wrongly convicted, that the legal system failed her, that she should be granted a new trial. But the conviction has held up. Her appeals have been denied. She will spend the rest of her life in prison. As for the other people in this story, Stephen's mother, Claudia Mitchell, has become an advocate for relationship counseling and mental health awareness. She's given talks at various churches and community centers about the dangers of infidelity, the importance of addressing betrayal in healthy ways, and the need for better access to mental health services. She's become a strong voice for her son's memory, making sure that he's not remembered merely as a man who cheated, but as a whole person who had value and potential and who was taken from this world too soon. Bianca's father struggled greatly after his daughter's conviction. He testified that he felt like he'd failed her, that he should have seen the signs of her mental health crisis and gotten her help before it was too late. He died 3 years after his daughter's sentencing. Friends say his heart was broken by what happened. Jennifer Kane, the woman who Stephen had the affair with, has largely stayed out of the public eye. She gave her testimony at trial and then tried to move on with her life. By all accounts, she was shocked and devastated to learn that her innocent message was somehow connected to Stephen's death. And Stephen's friends and colleagues all speak of him with genuine affection, acknowledging his mistakes but also mourning the man he could have become. So where does this leave us? What are we supposed to take away from a story like this? I think the lesson, if there is one, is about the fragility of human relationships and the importance of addressing trauma before it metastasizes into something uncontrollable. I think it's about the reality that we're all capable of hurting each other in profound ways, and that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who can hurt us deepest. I think it's about the need for honesty, for accountability, and for the humility to admit when a relationship has become toxic and needs to end. And I think, most importantly, it's about the fact that violence is never the answer. You can be hurt. You can be betrayed. You can be wronged. But the moment you respond to that hurt with violence, you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You've become a murderer. And no matter what your justification, no matter how much pain you were in, that's a reality you'll have to live with for the rest of your life. Bianca Torres will spend the rest of her life in a prison cell for the moment that she couldn't control her impulse toward violence. Stephen Mitchell will never have the chance to truly make amends for his infidelity because his life was stolen from him. And 2 families will carry the scars of this tragedy forever. That's the real story here. That's what matters. If this story has affected you, if you're sitting at home right now thinking about your own relationships, about the ways we hurt each other, about the line between love and violence, then I want to hear from you. Please comment on this video. Tell me what you think. Do you believe Bianca was justified? Do you think the legal system got it right? Do you think there's any scenario in which what she did was understandable? Or do you believe that no betrayal, no matter how profound, justifies taking another person's life? I genuinely want to know where you stand because this case raises questions that don't have easy answers. And if you've found yourself in a situation similar to Stephen and Bianca's, if you're struggling with betrayal in a relationship, if you're feeling like you're losing your mind with obsession and pain, please reach out. Talk to someone. There are resources available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 988. There are therapists and counselors who specialize in relationship trauma. You don't have to suffer alone, and you don't have to let your pain turn into violence. And if you've betrayed someone you love, if you've been unfaithful or dishonest, please understand the weight of what you've done. Understand that trust, once broken, is very difficult to repair. Understand that your partner's pain is real. And understand that if you can't genuinely commit to rebuilding that trust, then the kindest thing might be to let them go so they can heal. We're a community here at Dark Echoes Crime built on people who want to understand the complexity of human nature, who want to grapple with moral questions that don't have easy answers, who want to see the humanity in both perpetrators and victims. That's what you've been watching today, not a story of simple good versus evil, but a story of 2 people who loved each other and how that love turned toxic, how trauma compounded trauma, and how one moment of violence destroyed everything. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. And if you've watched this far, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd leave a comment. This community is built on conversation, on debate, on the willingness to engage with difficult questions. Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. And I want to hear what you think about Stephen and Bianca's story. Thank you for watching Dark Echoes Crime. I'll see you next time when we explore another story of how the human heart, that incredible, fragile, sometimes devastating thing, can lead us to places we never thought we'd go. Stay safe and be kind to each other.